Hi there. Who is ready for a little escapism from Trump and war? Um, Oddly enough, this I discovered this story myself while trying to get away from war and kind of other intense period in my life. We can get into that later if anyone's interested. Um, I hate doing readings or going to readings where the author just says hi and then disappears into his book for the rest of the time. Having said that, I'm just going to read a brief portion. Um, the main reason why I don't like reading, though, is that we have a 2.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, and so I'm worried that I'm going to start reading in a sing-song voice. But what I'm going to read to you is just a little snippet from the prologue here to kind of set the table. I'm going to just try to walk you through the scope of the book, and then what I really like doing is just having a conversation with you all. So I'm going to try to move as efficiently as possible, and then hopefully one of you at least will think of a question to ask me. Okay, so this deals with the events of June 23rd, 2009. By the time Edwin Rist stepped off the train onto the platform at Tring, 40 miles north of London, it was already quite late. The residents of the sleepy town had finished their suppers, the little ones were in bed. As he began the long walk into town, the train glided off into darkness. A few hours earlier, Edwin had performed in the Royal Academy of Music's London Soundscapes, a celebration of Haydn, Handel, and Mendelssohn. Before the concert, he'd packed a pair of latex gloves, a miniature LED flashlight, a wire cutter, and a diamond blade glass cutter in a large rolling suitcase and stowed it in his concert hall locker. He bore a passing resemblance to a lanky Pete Townsend, intense eyes, prominent nose, and a mop of hair, although instead of shredding a Fender, Edwin played the flute. There was a new moon that evening, making the already gloomy stretch of road even darker. For nearly an hour, he dragged his suitcase through the mud and gravel skirting the road under gnarly old trees strangled with ivy. A car blasted by, its headlights blinding. Adrenaline coursing, he knew he was getting close. The entrance to the market town of Tring is guarded by a 16th century pub called the Robin Hood. A few roads beyond, nestled between the old Tring Brewery and an HSBC branch, lies the entrance to Public Footpath 37. Known to locals as Bank Alley, the footpath isn't more than 8 feet wide and is framed by 7-foot-high brick walls. Edwin slipped into the alley into total darkness. He groped his way along until he was standing directly behind the building he'd spent months casing. All that separated him from it was the wall. Capped with 3 rusted strands of barbed wire, it might have thwarted his plans were it not for the wire cutter. After clearing an opening, he lifted his suitcase up to the ledge, hoisted himself up, and glanced anxiously about. No sign of the guard. He reached toward the window with the glass cutter and began to grind it along the pane. Cutting glass was harder than he'd anticipated, though, and as he struggled to carve an opening, the glass cutter slipped from his hand and fell into the ravine. His mind raced. Was this a sign? He was thinking about bailing on the whole crazy scheme when that voice, the one that had urged him onward these past months, shouted, "Wait a minute, you can't give up now. You've come all this way." He crawled back down and picked up a rock. Steadying himself atop the wall, he peered around in search of the guards before bashing the window out, wedging his suitcase through the shard-strewn opening, and climbing into the British Natural History Museum. If I didn't mention, this is all true, by the way. This is not, this is not fiction. Unaware that he had tripped an alarm in the security guard's office, Edwin pulled out the LED light, which cast a faint glow in front of him as he made his way down the hallways toward the vault, just as he'd rehearsed in his mind. He wheeled his suitcase quietly through corridor after corridor, drawing ever closer to the most beautiful things he'd ever seen. If he pulled this off, they would bring him fame, wealth, and prestige. They would solve his problems. He deserved them. He entered the vault, its hundreds of large white steel cabinets standing in rows like sentries, and got to work. He pulled out the first drawer, catching a waft of mothballs. Quivering beneath his fingertips were a dozen red-ruff fruit crows, gathered by naturalists and biologists over hundreds of years from the forests and jungles of South America. Their coppery orange feathers glimmered despite the faint light. Each bird, maybe 1.5 feet from beak to tail, lay on its back in funerary repose, eye sockets filled with cotton, feet folded close against the body. He unzipped his suitcase and began filling it with birds, emptying one drawer after another. Down in the security office, the guard was fixated on a small television screen. I feel obliged to relay that the British Museum virulently denies this part of the story, that the guard was engrossed in a soccer match, and that he hadn't yet noticed the alarm indicator blinking on a nearby panel. They insisted that the guard doesn't like soccer, and therefore it's not right. Edwin opened the next cabinet to reveal dozens of resplendent quetzal skins gathered in the 1880s from the Cherokee cloud forests of western Panama, a species now threatened by widespread deforestation and protected by international treaties. At nearly 4 feet in length, the birds were particularly difficult to stuff into his suitcase, but he maneuvered 39 of them inside by gently curling their sweeping tails into tight coils. He had lost track of how long he'd been in the vault when he finally wheeled his suitcase to a stop before a large cabinet. A small plaque indicated its contents, Paradiseidae. 37 king birds of paradise, swiped in seconds. 24 magnificent rifle birds. 17 flame bower birds. 12 superb birds of paradise. And just to introduce you to a superb bird of paradise, we're going to have our good friend David Attenborough. We should have volume here. That is the appropriate response, by the way. I've shown this to many crowds, and every now and then there's a crowd that does not react to this, and I must be doing something wrong.
Consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
Almost done with the reading here. The guard glanced at the CCTV feed, an array of shots of the parking lot and the museum campus. He began his round, pacing the hallways, checking the doors, scanning for anything awry. Edwin had long since lost count of the number of birds that passed through his hands. He'd originally planned to choose only the best of each species, but in the excitement of the plunder, he grabbed and stuffed until his suitcase could hold no more. The guard stepped outside to begin a perimeter check, glancing up at the windows and beaming his flashlight on the section abutting the brick wall of Bank Alley. Edwin stood before the broken window, now framed with shards of glass. So far, everything had gone according to plan, with the exception of the missing glass cutter. All that remained was to climb back out of the window without slicing himself open and melt into the anonymity of the street. Okay, there's 2 questions I'm going to set up and answer, and then I want to go to Q&A with you all if you're interested. First question is, what on earth does the British Museum of Natural History, which is home to the second largest collection of ornithological specimens on the face of the planet, they have 750,000 of these bird skins in their cabinets. Why are they there? What were they being used for? How did they get there in the first place? And secondly, what possessed Edwin Rist, a 20-year-old American from New York City, to climb the wall that night and to steal what ended up being millions of dollars worth of these birds? The easiest way to answer the first question is by introducing you. Does anyone know the name Alfred Russel Wallace? This man is, Americans should love him for the simple reason that he is this classic underdog story. He's kind of famous for being not famous, but Alfred Russel Wallace was a naturalist. He was inspired by Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, but Wallace had something only like 7 or 8 years of formal education. He did not come from a prominent family. But he wanted to undertake an expedition of his own in Darwin's footsteps in pursuit of an answer to the question that was dogging all naturalists of that period in the mid-19th century, namely, what is the origin of species? Why do some die off? What gives rise to new species? And Wallace, when he was in his early 20s, went down to Brazil, where he spent 4.5 years amassing a huge collection of specimens and the Rio Negro, which feeds into the Amazon. He had endured all kinds of, hardship and illness, and after 4 years, he loaded up 10,000 specimens, bird skins that he had painstakingly preserved, beetles, pressed plants, fish skeletons, all kinds of notebooks filled with sketches of different species. And the goal of this was to bring these back and to spend the next decade or two closely examining the divergence of his species and to compare them with what was at the British Museum at the time. Except 2 weeks into his return voyage, he was woken up in his cabin by one of the sailors on the boat telling him that the boat was on fire, that the ship was on fire. And he scampered up to the quarterdeck. There was smoke curling up through the planks. He had also loaded up a small menagerie of living animals, of parrots and monkeys who were all running. They'd broken from their cages and were running back and forth trying to escape the flames. And Wallace, not really in a clear frame of mind, ran down to his cabin and he grabbed a pocket watch and his sextant, and that was it. All of his notebooks and 4 years of his specimens all went up in smoke. They're at the bottom of the ocean now. He returned to London completely threadbare, with no real scientific achievement, and almost didn't survive that setback. But astonishingly, within 18 months, he wrote 2 books, published something like 24 journal articles, and basically got himself back upright and wrote his way into these scientific societies, who then supported his next expedition to Indonesia and Malaysia, what was then called the Malay Archipelago. While Wallace is there, and this is where he's gathering the birds of paradise and other specimens, he succumbs to a malarial fever, and in the midst of this fever has a eureka moment where he suddenly, the whole answer to the origin of species presents itself to him, and he's waiting impatiently for the fever to pass. And after about a half a day, when he finally feels up to it, he races off to his and starts writing out this paper, which he puts in an envelope and he mails to Charles Darwin. And it is the first article ever written. It's the first theory on evolution through natural selection came from Wallace. Darwin had been working on it for 15 years, but he'd been too scared to publish anything at that point. There's whole shelves written about this extraordinary moment in scientific history, but for our purposes, the reason why Wallace is important is that he came back to London, and Darwin was famous the world over for a theory that Wallace had independently figured out as well. But he was unfazed by it, and he spent the remaining years of his life imploring the British government to protect these collections, because Wallace understood that these specimens, he described them as the deep volumes of the Earth's history, and that if we allow ourselves to lose them, we're blinding ourselves. Future generations won't be able to infer anything from these collections. Upon his death in 1913, 2 years later, the threats to this collection began. The German Zeppelins dumped something like 200,000 pounds of thermite bombs on London. During World War II, during the Blitz, the British Museum of Natural History was hit 28 times, which prompted the curators to marshal an army of unmarked trucks where they secreted out Wallace's birds and Darwin's birds under cover of night, and they brought them to this tiny little museum in Tring, which was actually Lord Rothschild's museum that he had just given to the British Museum. And it was there that they, after surviving Hitler, after surviving all of these incredible threats to their existence, the Brits finally felt that this collection was safe. And over the course of the next, since these have been in the museum's collection, these specimens have unlocked one thing after another. Each new generation of scientists poses new questions to them. We understand not only evolution through natural selection, we can definitively prove that mercury levels are rising in the ocean, because we can look at mercury accumulation in a bird from 1850, one from 1900, one from 1950. They hold answers to questions that scientists haven't even thought to ask yet. Now, At the same time that Wallace was having all of these breakthroughs, something else was happening, which was an industrialized slaughter of birds for women's fashion. Marie Antoinette wedged a diamond-encrusted egret feather in her hair and set off a global, they called it the feather fever. It is the single largest destruction of wildlife in the history of mankind, direct destruction of wildlife. This was the Louis Vuitton bag of the 19th century, was how exotic was the bird that you could wear in your hat. This is what gave rise to the modern conservation movement, to the reemergence of the Audubon Society. The first conservation laws passed and the first preserves passed, created in the United States were meant to protect exotic birds from poachers. At the same time that that was happening, and I hope I've got my slide right here, this brings us to the second question, which is why, oh, and sorry, this is a king bird of paradise. This is one of the ones that Wallace, he was the first Western naturalist to gather this specimen and to identify it to science. 37 of these were stolen by Edwin that night. At the same time as the feather fashion was exploding, these British aristocrats were plucking these valuable feathers from their wives' hats, and they were creating these, which is the reason why Edwin climbed the wall that night. This is a Victorian salmon fly, which is tied according to these very exacting and precise recipes, they're called, that will require something like 15 different species of exotic birds. And this is a way for British fly fishermen that were fishing for salmon to show off their worldliness. They would come up with these fancy names like the Green Highlander and Exordium and the Jock Scott, Greenwell's Fancy, all of these different things. And it is, I have tied one of these. It does not appeal to me, but it is, there are whole nasty fights over whether or not it should be 6 twists of tinsel or thread versus 5, or how many feathers should be used from this species versus that species. This is, you would think, would have kind of gone the way of feathered hats, but this hobby exists to this day, and there is a diehard group of men. It is only men. I've spent 6 years on this. I once thought that I found a female salmon fly tyer on Facebook in a private group, but it was her husband using her account to post his. And this is a hobby that is defined by a lack of materials, that you cannot go to Papua New Guinea and just kill a bird of paradise. You can't get a resplendent quetzal very easily. And so there is a natural hierarchy in this community of the masters who have all kinds of disposable income that they can buy these things. And there are hundreds of these patterns, and you can gather real status if you can claim that you've tied this one and you've only used the authentic feathers from the right recipes. An important thing to note is that salmon are colorblind when they're spawning. They're not feeding when they're spawning. They're striking out of aggression to protect the eggs that they've just laid. There is no earthly reason why a salmon in Scotland should be attracted to a bird of paradise feather from the highlands of New Guinea. This is, sorry to be crass, this is all bullshit. This has no meaning. This is just humans trying to impress other humans by having fancy things. Do you remember the bird I just showed you? That is one of the most unique tail feathers on the planet. That's actually a long feather that over millions of years coiled up through evolution into this tiny emerald disc, and when the bird is in a branch, it will wave these 2 discs to try to attract a partner. This fly is called the Elvis has left the building fly, and the guy who tied it is, just to give you a taste of how bonkers this story became for me, the guy who tied it is part of an end times cult in South Africa who goes around the world just as a professional hunter, just blowing animals off the face of the planet. And when I found out that, I confronted him and I said, I've heard that you have some of the birds of paradise, including that one. And he told me, he's like, yeah, I have them. I'm not going to give them back. And I said, well, why? And he goes, because the museum is, these curators are doing the work of the devil, and they're preaching evolution, and the world's all going to come to an end anyways, and so they can come try to get them from me, but they're never going to succeed. Okay, so one quick thing. So Edwin got into fly tying as a 10-year-old boy. He was very quickly advanced through this community. He was heralded as the future of fly tying by Fly Tyer magazine, which my wife groans because we're now subscribers to the. But he was a master at this at a very young age. But his mastery was always defined by this need to use substitute feathers, they're called, but dyed turkey or pheasant or chicken feathers, because he couldn't afford the real things. And so, as good as he was always kind of longing to. And he told me that the knowledge of the falsity of the fly eats away at you when you know that you've used a substitute. And so Edwin, who is a virtuoso flautist, was accepted to the Royal Academy of Music, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world for musicians. And shortly before he left, one of his mentors said, "You've got to get to this museum. You've got to see these birds." And he wrote to them under false pretenses, said he was a student photographer helping a friend who was doing a dissertation on the birds of paradise, and they gave him access. And he spent that first visit casing the place. He was taking photographs of the hallways and the location of each cabinet and where it was in proximity to the exit and where the windows and how high were the windows above the ground. And he then spent the subsequent 8 months plotting this out, figuring out what would the ideal day be to go, what his route would be. I still will never be able to prove or know for sure if I have a theory that he carved a prosthetic nose to alter his identity, but I don't know for sure. But he emerged that night. The guard did not catch him, and I'm just going to race through the last couple of points here. The museum did not even realize that it had been burgled for something like 2 months after the heist. When they saw the broken glass, they raced over to make sure that Darwin's birds were still there, and it's kind of a final blow to Wallace. If they had given Wallace the appropriate respect, they would have checked his cabinets too. But when they accounted for Darwin's birds, they just wrote it off as a breaking and entering, someone looking for a laptop, and that was it. And it wasn't until a couple months later that a researcher pulled open a drawer and found it empty, and pulled open the drawer below and found it empty. And the final tally was that he stole 299 of these birds, worth well over $1 million. He missed his last train back to London that night, so he didn't sleep. He was sitting at the train station all night with $1 million of birds in his suitcase, worried that the cops were coming for him. But he got back to his dorm room and started plucking the feathers, which he sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars to this community. Some of the guys were so addicted to this stuff and so desperate to get it that some of them boarded a plane from the United States to fly to London just to browse his wares. He was eventually caught, and I won't give away everything in the book, but he lawyered up and never spent a night behind bars. And by the time I came into the story, he had just received a suspended sentence, and because the Brits were so embarrassed by this, they closed the case, even though half the birds were missing. So the last act of the feather thief is my kind of obsessive global search for these missing skins. Because in stealing these things, he blew open a hole in the scientific record that can never be filled again. We can't go back to 1850 and get another bird of paradise. And we don't know what answers might have been, or what questions might have been posed to that specimen in 50 years or 100 years from now. I'll just say it took me 4 years to get him to agree to an interview. My wife, who was a lawyer by training, kept wondering why he agreed to talk, and she came to Dusseldorf, Germany to the interview with me, and she was working the microphone, and I could sense her like leaning in to say to Edwin, like, don't answer this question, like this is not. But we had just gotten married, and in my past life, I'd been in Iraq. I was kind of used to uncertain situations, but we were trying to get pregnant, and I was like, as much as I knew about what this kid had done in breaking into a museum, I didn't really know, was he a violent person? If he, was there any risk that he might do something during this interview? And I thought, okay, if there's a 1% chance, I should mitigate it. And so I went on Yelp Dusseldorf, and I hired a 6'4" bodyguard named Klaus, who showed up. I swear to God, he showed up in a tracksuit with it looked like he had cut his own hair that morning. And he gave us a walkie-talkie, and he's like, I'm going to go hide in the hallway, and if something happens, you just squelch the walkie-talkie and I'll come in. And so because I was kind of all hands on deck with the interview, I gave the walkie-talkie to my wife, and she hid it under the cushion, and she was going to squawk it if something happened. And at the 6-hour marker, when Edwin admitted something shocking to me, I look over at my wife, who is severely jet-lagged, and she's completely passed out on the couch, and the walkie-talkie is in plain sight there, and her hand is right, which adds a whole layer to like a tense interview when you're hoping that your interviewee doesn't see the thing that will summon the bodyguard to take him out. I managed to kind of cough loudly, but towards the end of that interview, and I hope I've got the right clip here loaded up, we were kind of making small talk, and I said, how has this affected your life now? Like, I mean, when you go out on a date and say, just if you Google me, you'll see that I'm I'm a feather thief and all this. And I saw his brow furrow when I said the word thief. And I asked him, I was like, is that a loaded term? I mean, do you not like to be called that? And I'm hoping to have the right clip here, but this is what he told me.
I try to refrain from certain words. Thief is one of them, because I don't feel, it's going to sound very strange, I don't feel like a thief. To me, a thief is somebody who, is sort of, waiting for you to look the other way, picks your pocket, and then makes off with your wallet, and then the next day is there back looking for the next victim. Or for me, it's a really negative term. And granted, it is a term that applies to me. Burglar applies to me. That's another word I don't like using. And it's just, it's this really negative connotation. It's this social degenerate that nobody wants to associate with, because you're a bad person or something like that. You're these words that you don't want to be called, because personally I don't view myself as a thief in the way that I see it. I'm not a thief in that sense. People can leave their wallet with me.
He did. I'm not a psychologist, but I think they call that compartmentalization. He did not steal my wallet. There's another part to that clip where he's like, you notice? Like, you see your wallet's still here? Okay, one more thing. Everyone asks what Edwin's doing now, and this is my quickest way of answering it, and then we'll get into questions. This is him. And he's playing a heavy metal flute rendition of Metallica's Master of Puppets. And this has, I think, 1 million views on YouTube. He has a number of these clips, and I've never figured out why, but in every one there are always 3 Edwins. And this goes on for a very long time, so I'm going to stop it there. But he is performing in symphonies and orchestras throughout Europe to this day. And I have some more, if it warrants it by any of the questions, I have some more photos and things that we can dip into later. But I hope that kind of sets the table here, and I would love to just have a conversation with you all if anyone has a question. Yeah?
I have just a quick question. Your middle name is Wallace. Are you related?
No, but it has... am I related to Alfred Russel Wallace? No, but it has kind of taken on a new meaning to me, that name, and our son, his middle name is Wallace now. And I will say, when I was on the British portion of the book tour, I built in a day so that I could go down to the southern coast, and I met with his 94-year-old grandson, who gave me one of the worst lunches I've ever had. It was like gas station deli meat from a year earlier. Um, but towards the end of that meeting, he's just a very sweet guy, and there's all these, photos that I've never seen of Wallace and hanging around the house. And I said, well, do you have anything else of your grandfather's here, any other relics? And he brings me down this hallway to a little room, points to a small dresser in the corner, and I open up the bottom drawer, and there under a pile of correspondence with Darwin and others that has not even been scanned, there was the pocket watch and the sextant that he saved from the burning ship, and the field glasses that he used during the 8-year expedition to the Malay Archipelago. And he is still kind of, when I told him that I was going to have dinner with David Attenborough that evening, he got his eyes bulged and he goes, I met him a couple years ago, but I was so nervous around him that I forgot to tell him who I was. And so there's something about the Wallaces that don't assert themselves, I don't think, but no, not related. Yeah.
What's your background and what got you interested in doing what you're doing now?
So this is a very abrupt shift, but what's my background? I studied Arabic and Middle Eastern history in college. I was doing a Fulbright in Egypt when the Iraq War started. I was opposed to the war, but I come from a family of public servants, and where it was not enough to just formulate an opinion. If you feel something, you ought to do something about it. And so I felt I had an ethical obligation to try to go help with the reconstruction of Iraq, because I kept reading about how our government didn't have anyone that spoke the language or really knew anything about the region. And so I went over as a 24-year-old with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I was in charge. I was the first person sent to rebuild Fallujah. I was the only person working for USAID in Iraq that spoke Arabic. My first book is a memoir of this. It's called To Be a Friend is Fatal, but the compressed version is that after coming back to the States, a number of my Iraqi colleagues were assassinated because they were seen as traitors for helping the Americans, and I realized that our government was doing nothing to help them. And I had never helped a refugee before. I didn't know anything about how to be a public advocate or anything like that. I just was frankly pissed off about what I saw as a betrayal, and so I started speaking out and unwittingly kind of was thrust into the front of this cause for the better part of a decade. So within 6 months of writing my first op-ed, I was running a nonprofit. I was testifying before Congress, working closely with Teddy Kennedy and others, and building this army of pro bono lawyers from all the top law firms to help the Iraqis on my list. And so I spent about 8 years fighting on behalf of tens of thousands of these Iraqis, and then subsequently the Afghans who were in the same plight. I thought when Obama got elected that my troubles were over and we would just, press a different button and they would all get in, but the problems were just it was just as challenging under Obama. And so after many years, I really started to feel trapped in a kind of cage of my own creation. I felt it was meaningful what I was doing, but it would take years to get a single person out. And sorry to say, but our country doesn't really, no one is morally or emotionally invested. No one has any skin in the game in these wars. So it was very hard to keep an organization funded, and I just was really getting burnt out. And the only peace of mind that I could find was in fly fishing, because when you go up onto one of these rivers in the mountain streams, your cell phone signal stops working. And to fly fish properly, if you're thinking about other stuff, you're not doing it right. You got to slow down and pay attention to the way the water is breaking over the boulders and the size of the insects that are tumbling off of the bottoms of leaves on the riverbanks. And I would spend eight hours fishing, but it would feel like 30 minutes to me, and I would be totally recharged. And it was during one of these outings, I was in northern New Mexico, north of Taos, and the guide that I found just through Google to kind of show me the ins and outs of that river, which fed into the Rio Grande, at one point opened up his fly box and I saw one of these beautiful salmon flies. Because when you fish for trout, you use these ugly little things. They're like, it's just a, you know, yeah, they work, exactly. But they're made to mimic insects. And I'd never seen a salmon fly. And my guide happened to be in this tight-knit community. And as we started talking about it, he goes, well, if you think that's crazy, you should hear about this young American flautist that just broke into the British Museum of Natural History and filled up a suitcase with $1 million of birds, and he got away with it, and I think I know where some of them are. And all of a sudden I was like, it was just like a lightning bolt. And so I would go and meet at the White House on pushing refugee cases, and I'd check back into my hotel room, and I would secretly log into these private forums and like take screenshots of illicit transactions, and it was a kind of private hobby of my own just to see if I could figure it out, and then it grew into something much bigger. So I don't know if that answers it, but sorry. Yeah. Oh, it was 15 months from the time of the, oh, sorry, how long, what was the timeline from being caught to being sentenced? It was 15 months after the museum discovered that they had been robbed that Edwin was found. And it was not, how did they find him? One of his customers was just blabbing and was showing off one of these bird skins to at a fly tying festival in this small Dutch town, and one of the other attendees was an undercover cop who wasn't assigned to the case. He was from the police service of Northern Ireland, and he would do these 12-hour stakeouts, and to keep himself from going insane during these stakeouts, he would tie flies. So it was just a private hobby of his, but he knew about the burglary, and that's how he started piecing it together. I think, oh, that's a bird of paradise mounted on a woman's head. I'm just going to see if I can get to the, here's an example of how these are sold openly on eBay now. This is one of each species of the Katinga bird, and they're actually laid out on a patch of polar bear fur, just to show you how garish this is. There is the red-ruffed fruit crow. All of the breastplates have been severed off. There are about 600 of these orange feathers, and 2 of them will sell for like $50. And so this is the end result, is one of his customers, you can see the final product resting on the patch of bird that it had been hacked out of. Here's how he sold them in the private forums. Oh, I lost the thing there. I don't know if that was. Oh boy, ship's going down, folks. It's okay. So that's how he sold them on EdwinRisk.com. Am I doing something wrong? I can just stand very still here. Well, while we're figuring that out, yeah. So he was very. Oh, that is a $2,000 fly. There's $2,000 worth of feathers tied, and that was tied by, without giving the whole book away, but that was tied by his accomplice, who I confronted in a small town outside of Oslo, and he finally broke down after about 25 hours of interviews. I don't know why all these guys talked to me, but they did. That's a crime scene photo. That's the one I was trying to get to, but that's a box full of Katingas. That's how they were found. Just stuffed into Ziploc bags and things. Yeah.
You said that as a child, he was very qualified. So what started his interest?
I do. What started his interest in this? He was homeschooled. I was just having a conversation in the green room because one of the other authors homeschooled his kids, and I mentioned to him that the feather thief had kind of blamed homeschooling because they'd never really gotten into trouble, that it's just mom and dad if he misbehaves. And I even called the Homeschoolers Association of America and said, like, I need to check, but is there like a higher rate of criminality amongst and they were not happy with my question, but I had to ask. But his parents were both writers, and his dad wrote a series of kind of explainer articles, I think for Discover magazine or Popular Science. And one of them, he was writing a piece on the physics of fly casting, and his dad was watching an Orvis video on the kind of basics of fly fishing, and Edwin, as a 10-year-old, walked through the room while they were doing a demonstration of tying a simple trout fly. And it was a point in the process where it's called palmering, where you take an ordinary rooster hackle feather, and when you tether that to the shank of the hook, this is really nerdy stuff here, but when you then coil it around, every fiber of that feather shoots out, and it is transformed into something kind of extraordinary, and so then it helps the fly sit on the surface of the water. And it was that transformation that Edwin said, something so ordinary became so, alien to him. And right then he started running around the house looking for hooks, and he was pulling feathers from his mom's pillow, and then soon his parents were bringing him to fly tying classes at the local fly shop, and it all kind of went from there. No, he has a younger brother who is the principal clarinetist of the Met now. Yeah. Yes.
What was his possible defense?
Oh boy. What was his defense? Edwin did not go to prison because there's a lot to this story that is crazy. Because he received a diagnosis of Asperger's from Borat's cousin, Simon Baron Cohen, who is one of the world's leading experts on Asperger's. And just to bring it full circle, the point at which I looked over at my incredible wife who was sleeping on the couch during the interview was when Edwin, in my reading of it, essentially admitted to having faked it. And I'm paraphrasing, but I said to him at the 6-hour marker, I said, I don't want to sound like a jerk, but you don't seem like someone with Asperger's. I have people in my extended family with Asperger's. You're making direct eye contact. You're reading not just the subtext. He was seeing my lines of attack 10 questions in advance. If he was in the middle of an answer, he would adjust on the fly if he could see my brow furrow. And he told me, he said, well, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I basically became what I needed to become at that moment in life. And as he said this, he started rocking back and forth, and he said, there's repetitive movement and eye contact, and all of a sudden he started going like this and avoiding his eye contact. Another uncomfortable interview was me reaching out to Baron Cohen saying, did you get hoodwinked here? I mean, he's claiming something, and he admitted to me, Baron Cohen said that yes, it can be faked, but here you would hope that an expert clinician such as myself would smoke it out. But I was leaked his psychological assessment, and there's all kinds of just basic errors. There's no controls built into the process when it's in a criminal justice setting in terms of controls. If you know that your report is the only thing that's going to keep this kid out of prison. And the reason why it kept him out of prison is because this gets crazier. 10 years earlier, someone who truly had Asperger's became a grave robber in Bristol, England, and was collecting skulls and vertebrae. And he was released on appeal once it was determined that his diagnosis wasn't given significant weight. So once Edwin's lawyers had this diagnosis from this prestigious Baron Cohen, the judge, I have all the transcripts, the judge basically threw up his hands and said, I can't do anything other than to wish you luck because I know you're going to appeal and this will be overturned. It has since the crime, Asperger's is no longer a standalone diagnosis in the DSM-5, in part because of the kind of varied way in which diagnoses were being handed out. And the Baron Cohen wrote the diagnostic tool that my poor wife, I kept making her test me for Asperger's to see if I could fake it and break it and everything, which it's not that hard to figure out. We have 35 seconds left. Does anyone? Yeah.
How was he hoping to become rich from stealing all these feathers?
Well, he made hundreds of thousands of dollars from this because there are 2 resplendent Quetzal feathers are on eBay now for $100, and he had thousands and thousands of them. And they will always keep their value. They're only going to become more and more valuable. In fact, since my book has come out, the value of these specimens of many of the species has quintupled in price. And I should say the only other thing is that in the course of reporting this, I came across I'm at 4 other museum heists now done by Fly Tires. So this is not an isolated thing. They told me they're going to just cut my mic off right now. Thank you.